Welcome to the Integral Stage and to another episode of Meta Models, our series on all things meta, meta theory, meta psychology, meta studies. Today we're joined by Gregg Henriques, a professor at James Madison University, who has been working on a problem close to all integralists' hearts, unifying the field of psychology both within itself and with the broader human domains of science and spirituality, or the wisdom traditions. He has presented details of his unified theory of knowledge and tree of knowledge systems on Integral Stage before, but today we'd like to take time to dive a little bit deeper into his work. Layman, would you like to offer any introductory remarks before we get started?
I'd like to say that I admire Gregg's conciseness. I think his ability to be very comprehensive and inclusive with a very compact set of principles and statements is wonderful. I think maybe the reason I admire that is because it sort of duplicates and exemplifies the process of consilience and convergence itself. And then often, imaginatively, I extrapolate that into the future and see a telos-like condition of superintegration hovering over the horizon of reality. That's something you see too, Gregg, or is that a step too far?
No, that's exactly what I say. In fact, that's the if we do that well, the dream is to do that well, to unite the wisdom traditions, the emerging digital age, reverse the meta crises, and figure out a way to, be sustainable with both soul and Mother Earth and science and all of that. So, absolutely.
So how did you get started working in the area of meta theory and meta psychology? And were there any indicators early on in your life of a talent for big picture thinking and model building or anything like that?
No. Not really. Skipped school, hung out, and, went to James Madison, where I'm actually a professor now. It was certainly not early. I actually had a little trouble reading. My oldest brother's valedictorian, and I was sort of kind of in the shadow of that a little bit, and was not seen to have my talent, and actually it is a core talent, is that I could talk to people and very quickly empathize with where people are. And that's good for being a psychologist. And I like talking about human nature. I like talking about people's problems. I like what was humanistically real. What the hell really mattered to people. So I was always concerned about that. I also thought that my high school training was basically BS. So I was, in retrospect, I just wasn't engaged. But I did well enough to go to undergrad, and it was there. Actually met who's still a deep friend of mine. My first mentor, Joe Mikulski, a sociologist. He got me interested in feminism and sociology. I was always oriented towards psychology, but then I appreciated what would become sort of, the top-down version of the social context. I was aware that our household was far more biased in masculine thinking and values, and the echoes of or presence of sexism. To be woken to that from a feminist perspective started a process of shift, a transformation in my emerging adulthood. That transformation took off when I got into my graduate program, master's degree program in clinical community psychology at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And by that time, what was happening, in retrospect, I didn't know this, but my intuition, I learned to read well, so going from a slow reader to now a decent reader. And that was syncing up with my capacity for empathy. And then I propped myself into the graduate training program. Was super fortunate to have excellent mentors and fellow classmates. I think it was a real excellent 3-year period of training. And I got interested in psychotherapy. That's, of course, I was a clinical psychologist, and that's how I'm trained. But when I got into the room and could empathize with sort of what I called the best of the best, I was really struck by how different the paradigms were, how valuable they were when they were carried to with integrity and skill. And then why wasn't it the case that we just didn't have a way of making sense out of the paradigms in the classic metaphor of the blind man and the elephant? Okay, so my intuition, the second sort of real skill that I have, if empathy is one, it is coherent consilience. Like, I'm very inclined towards zooming out and seeing from the noise music, and I'm very driven towards that way. And I want to see an organismic worldview that is in harmony. And what I then found in psychotherapy was a lot of good but paradigmatic mid-level insights that do not have And so in retrospect, I didn't call it at the time, it's the problem of psychotherapy. And I was like, hey, why do I have to choose one of these, or is it just an eclectic blend? There's a movement called psychotherapy integration that I got interested in. And that's where the spark started to happen in my own transformation. It was 1994. Then I did something that no one else had done, which really is quite interesting. It was basically like, well, why aren't all of these unified on the science of psychology? If you think about modern medicine, so modern biological therapy as physicians, and modern Western medicine certainly is like, well, okay, there's human biology, and if we look at all the organ systems and all of that, that provides a basic, relatively coherent frame for that. So then I turned afresh, looked back to my home discipline, and said, well, why don't we organize around that? And with that new lens, I was like, oh my God, psychology is a shit show at the science level. And I fell into that. I was very interested then in evolutionary psychology for a little while. And then I realized that was a nightmare. And that set the stage then for some key insights that I had late 1996 into 1997. And from that point on, my frame and fascination and life purpose has all been pretty clear.
I've got two related questions. And one is, yes, we can build these artifacts, these models that unify things in a nice way, and we can export those to other people, and perhaps they can be implemented by systems. Same time, it seems like that has to be backed up by individuals who have a skill set similar to the one you're describing in yourself, like a capacity for empathy, for shifting perspectives, for moving into paradigms, making sense of them, and then zooming out and trying to take that all together. So to what degree are the models really useful apart from that skill? And when we look at that skill in you, like how much is temperament and how much could be taught? How much could be cultivated in other people who don't have that temperament?
Sure. Okay, so I'll break those up into the two questions. So one of the real dangers for metasystemic thinkers, okay, is that you fall in love with your model, you find your home to consilience, and if you're sort of obsessed with that and its precision, you then basically you have this ideal fantasy that this is your perfect true knowledge and you see it as it. And then if you're not grounded, you'll become a broadcaster, okay? And you're like, this is true, this is true, this is true, okay? Well, good luck then getting a bunch of broadcasts that have their own particular truth angle and then just broadcast them together, but you can't actually synthesize or connect or drop into the empathy of this. So I absolutely am a integrative pluralist. And what I mean by that is I think there are lots of different ways to see the elephant. I think we broke the damn elephant up, but there are a lot of angles to see the elephant. Okay. And there are many. So if Ken Wilber climbs up one side of a mountain here, and while I disagree with him some, he is seeing parts of the same elephant I'm seeing, and I'm climbing up in a different way. In fact, I'm seeing lots of seers who are seeing aspects of it, and you will always see aspects of it from different places. Okay. And what I worry about is a lot of people get metasystemic people get obsessed with their version of reality. And then the question is, how well does that connect and sync up with others? And when it doesn't, then you have sort of a totalitarian fantasy that this is the truth rather than that's a theory of reality. It ain't a reality. Okay. So that's a big deal. The second question you asked is a great one in terms of my own. You definitely need a particular talent to do what I did. There's no doubt about that. You know, I have particular talents, and if you aren't dispositionally inclined, both at a temperamental level and at an ability level, there'd just be no way. Okay, and that's why do you think it's never really been addressed? I mean, other people have tried to solve the problem of psychology in particular ways, but and every one of them that does a decent job has particular talents that the normal person, and I don't mean that pejoratively, I just mean in relationship to time. Now, the second question, though, is the system that I constructed translatable, okay, so that other people can then internalize it, and then will it be generalized? Okay. And then does it then have enough coherence, integrity, and arrangement so that the language system holds as it grows and then distributes itself? And that's all to be determined. That's definitely to be determined. I'm feeling like, a lot of different things need to line up, although it feels more than I would have said 6 years ago. It feels like those things are actually starting to line up in a particular way. Certainly one thing that clearly needs to happen is that the zeitgeist, the culture around me, okay, needs to be at a particular place. Okay, so I was inside the blue church of the Academy of Psychology, and that's where I've been my whole life. And that damn culture was never interested at a zeitgeist level to actually try the task of absorbing what it is that I'm offering. So they, at an individual level, I could always talk to people and everyone would say, oh my gosh. And I got hired for because I got very lucky in my position. There was this unique program at James Madison. But I got super lucky. I got synced up with that. And then I got hired for my theory. That was very unusual. But we were unusual and I was unusual. The system itself had no interest really at an institutional level. In fact, it was institutionally defined against a lot of what I was saying. So 5 years ago, I was just sort of like, getting a little frustrated. I can speak more about that. And was really thinking this is not going to go. I was also getting more alienated from where the institution was. And then a whole interesting set of things happened. I think maybe happened to a lot of people in the space. It actually does yoke into Jordan Peterson and his impact on the culture. I got sucked into the intellectual dark web and the deep web. And then I basically launched my place outside of the academy. I'm still a full professor. I'm keeping my job, thank you. But thankfully, I'm now a full professor. I can do what I want. And so now I'm out here into the integral meta-modern space, right? That has a zeitgeist of a number of people thinking, yeah, this modernist system of thinking, it's on its last legs. We need an upgrade, a new operating system that's necessary. When you're in that zeitgeist, that's one of the key things that if this thing's going to be successful. And then we'll see how people digest it and, my ability to share it and all of that. And it's feeling exciting these days, but a lot of, I'll let you know in a decade.
We just talked recently with Mark Edwards. I'm not sure if you know him, but he's
Sure.
a professor in Sweden right now and one of the best known metatheorists in the integral community besides Ken Wilber. And one of the things he talks about is the problem of methodology and metatheory.
Definitely.
And that metatheory, more often than not, is the idiosyncratic product of an individual thinker drawing from their creativity, predispositions, insights.
Totally.
And it then gets disseminated. But if there's no methodology behind it, it's hard to generate a global community of inquiry without it becoming basically just the application of a received system. So he's looking at and wanting to explore what is the methodology that can support basically the generation of metatheory. Is there a method behind the madness, or after the madness spell, can method be generated that can be reflexively applied to help refine and support and test the metatheory so that it can become a thriving community of inquiry?
Brilliant. Yeah, the issue of method is huge. Method across multiple levels. The institution needs a method to replicate itself. You have to have, and this has always been one of the real challenges that I've encountered at multiple levels. So I appreciate Mark Edwards' point here. And so here's what happened to me. I'm not a huge fan of method per se. So that's just a dispositional kind of thing. So I want the method really to be in the life world, life quest of individuals. Okay. And I'm certainly I have a love-hate relationship with empirical methodology. Okay. I'm trained as a behavioral empirical scientist. And I actually basically it was like, oh shit, I bought all into this. Like this was my fundamentalism. And now I'm actually on the other side of that in a particular way. So my own unique history is going to have a weird relationship with method. But here's what happened to me, which I think makes my system a little different than what Mark's talking about, or at least it's an interesting, odd outlier. Okay. You hear me all the time talk about the problem of psychology. Okay. So one of the things I'll tell you right away is that there is an established and crystal clear academic problem that I am dealing with. Okay. So this is not like, oh, we're just confused and here I have a wonderful system and and as long as you follow it, this is great. Okay. That's not what this is. This is, no, there's a specific, I can hone you into a language conceptual problem, okay, which I've now expanded into what I call the enlightenment gap. Okay. I've talked about because I'm writing a book now called The Problem of Psychology and the Solution. And then I frame the enlightenment gap as the modernist system of understanding, okay, that at least at the level of philosophy and science, if we say from Hume to Kant in philosophy and Galileo into Newton, that then gets solidified, okay? Now, other things that are, of course, happening to modernity, but if that gets solidified as sort of, okay, this is the beginning of modern physics and philosophy with Kant, all right? That system, the way it evolves, has no good capacity to solve two foundational problems, one of which is matter and mind. Okay, that's why we get the mind-body problem. And the other is the clear relationship between society and social knowledge and scientific knowledge. And that's why we get modernism and postmodernism. So the Enlightenment gap and the absence of that understanding conceptually, the problem of psychology then is a natural consequence of the Enlightenment gap. That is, if you're going to try to develop a science of mind, whatever the hell you would mean by that, which is then the problem, you would have social knowledge, science knowledge, mind knowledge, matter knowledge. It's a shit show. Sorry, it's a trouble. Okay, and then boom, now you get my discipline. So now what I'm saying is that, and this is why actually, rather than go to method, I actually go to metaphysics, okay? And then I go to what I call descriptive metaphysics, whereby descriptive metaphysics means that you have to be anchored to scientific empiricism at one level. In other words, I'm not going to go pure metaphysics. I'm going to go descriptive metaphysics that's an anchor to the naturalist worldview, show that the metaphysical understanding of naturalism is completely inadequate, and show my metaphysical understanding is 10 times better. And now I'm saying, I'm inviting people to play my language game, and then we'll see how it works in relationship to life and living and all of that. But it then becomes an interesting, that's where I'm at in relationship to inviting folks to apply the method, learn the language game, and just hone in at least on the problem it solves. And then the process really is, I'm a clinician. So I'm really interested in people's life quest, all right? And certainly we need societal, institutional things, but I go to the level of the individual heart, its head, the life that you lead. I also talk about start with your garden, a lot of garden metaphors I'll use. And then the method of building a life quest that's satisfying. Of course, to answer that question, is really complicated. And I appreciate Mark's view, but that Mark's view is absolutely justified in the context of the academy, like the academy needs that, and social systems need that. And I hope to find that. My frame is metaphysics and the individual and the worldview. So that's where I am. And time will tell whether that generalizes.
Okay, metaphysical question. You got this elephant, you got all these different angles on it. There's two ways to look at that. One is, say, holographically, where there is a whole real elephant and we're only seeing parts of it. Another way is constructively, where we have all these visions. There isn't really an elephant, but we could make one by putting them together. What's your take on that? On whether the greater whole is given or is the greater whole constructed?
That's a great question. I certainly basically answer the former more than the latter. Okay. Now I think there's a really complicated. So I like John Vervaeke's inventio kind of notion. There is realize the tension between what I would call the ontological side of the belief relative to the ontic reality of what you discover, and the interrelationship between your ontological claims and the ontic reality is a very complicated relation. But the tree of knowledge basically says we could understand the elephant of the knowledge that science has given us 10 times more effectively than we currently do. And then if we all saw that, and then basically I pull out first chaos of like, what is science now? Well, there is no scientific worldview, who the hell knows? And then exhibit A and B can be Edward Wilson's consilience and big history. Okay, so these are, and big history and consilience give you sort of, hey, there is sort of an edge here. If you go from Big Bang to present and from quantum to sociology, we actually can box in that elephant a little bit. Okay. Then I come along and say, yeah, but you guys are still screwed because you can't figure out mind in relationship to that. And then I say, well, okay, I can do that. I can now pick up that ball with the tree of knowledge arrangement. All right. And then basically say, oh, if you have the 4 dimensions of complexity of matter, life, mind, and culture, which people have surprisingly been confused about, then you align the frequencies of behavior across those different dimensions, then everything comes in line and that elephant pops for you. So it's mostly the former, although I absolutely appreciate there are a lot of complicated reasons why it's got a little bit of the latter in it.
Yeah, Bruno Latour uses a word which I think he means something similar to John Vervaeke with his Inventio, and Bruno talks about instauration. And for him, instauration means something that is simultaneously a discovery and an invention or a creation. Exactly. And I think it's always a mix like that.
Yeah, it depends on the nature of the problem. I mean, sometimes there are some discoveries you can make. You say, I think this thing's out here, and then you go and you dig it up from the earth and say, see, I told you. That's a discovery. But absolutely, these theoretical abstract concepts absolutely going to have an onto-epistemological from the view of the knower, that then interfaces with them in particular lensing ways that then do have this invention discovery complexity. In fact, this is one of the great problems of psychology itself, in my argument, the science of it. If you don't appreciate, if you're just going to say, well, we're going to discover the way you are, right? I'm going to discover the way you are, Bruce, and then I'm going to tell you the way you are, right? As if that then doesn't change what you are. and then all of a sudden, right? So now as you invent, you discover, or John's concept of realization, right? Realization both means I'm going to realize something and I'm going to make something. Well, that interface feedback loop is unbelievably tricky, okay? And you better recognize that where it's present and when it's often very, very present. So it's definitely both and, but the tree of knowledge does allow you to see the scientific natural elephant in just a clearer and different way.
What will it look like if you are successful in your project?
Great. Yeah, so here's the vision that I have right now is as follows. And this is this is the 30-year plan. get to the half mark of the century. And this will sound grandiose, but I feel like I'm part of a grandiose vision. I certainly believe with a lot of futurist thinkers that the current course is quite unsustainable. Okay. I like Steve Pinker's enlightenment, vision, but I also think that he fails to appreciate the accelerating press that we are putting on many, many different things. And the enlightenment version of reality, to the extent that we simply follow it, has many, many self-terminating elements. Okay? So I'm pretty terrified that the Enlightenment has given us in its current form, the Titanic, and there's an iceberg. Okay, and we're already bumping up against some early indicators of that. And hopefully we're not locked into it in the next 5 years, or else we're in deep trouble. Okay. But the argument is that if there's a particular kind of consciousness shift that could happen over a 30-year period that we have time for, you can definitely see that we transition from a scientific modernist obsession with certain forms of knowledge, okay, but are not an integrated, pluralistic, holistic understanding of wisdom, that we will then transition into clarity about scientific knowledge, what I often refer to as men's knowledge. Okay, by that I mean modernist, empirical, natural science knowledge, okay, which are the 4 key elements that really justify its emergence. And of course, I call it men's to show the postmodern critique of what it represents, white men fusing with dominance in a particular way and overextending what the transcendent knowledge that they were communicating and failing to appreciate the complicated issues of language, of invention, of bias, of self-serving, all that shit that then creates the space there for trouble. We need to consolidate that. The tree of knowledge offers that, okay, in a coherent way to give us rise to a picture of men's knowledge, and then realize that just needs to ground. That's not the end of the story. Knowledge that, abstract knowledge is not the end of the story. Abstract knowledge is embodied, and we need to actually have a wisdom orientation. A wisdom orientation, men's knowledge then becomes women's knowledge. And so ultimately the idea is that if we can sync up and realize that modernity is coming to, its proper end and have some sort of renaissance, enlightenment shift, all right, that actually appreciates what we need to do is seek wisdom, all right, and grounded in coherent knowledge, then we have that awakening. And then that awakening happens amongst the seers. The seers figure out a way to translate that into the community. I often will say it's an archetypal masculine project to get there, and then a feminine project to get it to the community. I say that with somebody who's got a foundationally feminine heart. I'm a therapist. I can't see people suffering. It makes me cry, and I want to take care of them. That's my, it's an archetypal feminine core, but I have a scientific masculine seeking. And so that's what I mean by those things, but then bring it into the core, bring it into the communitas and the commons, have the system digest that, and then get it to the children. And then to use Zach Stein's frame, have a resurgence of teacherly authority, have a shift in education at the fundamental meaning of socialization, and then raise individuals to a fundamental, a different way of being. So for example, capitalist modernist structures turn everybody, at least in the commons, to an instrumental agent of bottom line efficiency marked by money, which is corrosive to the soul. Okay, the soul doesn't want to just be used as an instrument. It wants relational value. It wants to be known and valued. Okay, so we need to shift our capital structures from instrumentality to core valuing of each other. If we do something like that, that's not a huge shift, but it's got a lot of implications. If we actually figure out how to value people's souls in the 20th century, 21st century, well, that'd make a big difference in the kinds of transformations that would be possible.
Amen. One of the classical problems with philosophy, spirituality, and wisdom teachings historically is that they've over-anchored themselves in some current scientific notion of the day, which was then later overturned.
Yep.
So to what degree is your vision really bound to our current knowledge of what the scientific domains are, and to what degree would it hold in place even if there was some radical disruption to one of our ways of knowing and sets of assumptions about science?
That's a brilliant question. Yeah, so it is anchored to, when I'm anchoring it to, I'll tell you what it's anchored to. Okay, so it is anchored to an outline of the Big Bang cosmology. Okay, so there is some sort of matter space-time collapse. It can be a big bounce. It can be all sorts of different things inside of that, but it definitely, if the Big Bang, if steady state theory is the actual thing, then there is a grounding of justification that I'm slipping on immediately. And I've told everybody from the beginning that I am trailing that line of justification. And if that justification goes, okay, I've been very specific about what I'm really trailing, and the depiction of the tree of knowledge captures that trail. So if that goes, well, unlike Trump, I'm not just going to try to hold on and say, no, it really went. It's like, okay, I'm in trouble here. This thing, the dominoes of justification are going to start to go. I believe that cell theory, natural selection, and genetics are big pieces of the puzzle that help understand what life is. If you get an astrobiological thing that blows that out of the water, that's really different. If there are genuine consciousness systems that do not need to be mediated by the nervous system, and what I mean by human psychological consciousness, there are noetic sciences. If you track those particular kinds of things, now lots of them could be, there is an electromagnetic wave that you can sync up on, and then, okay, but if there's an entire nother field, okay, that's encompassing us that we don't know anything about, that's actually generating and beaming into our nervous system that allows for a collective consciousness that I don't know anything about, my system's in deep trouble that way. So it certainly anchors itself to a particular version of naturalism at its base. Now, that said, I'm also a clinician. So the left-hand side of that tree is the pure reason side, and as any pure reason system is going to be anchored to particular types of truth claims that can be qualified. I mean, I think that natural selection is blowing up in some ways, but the way I'm anchored to it is still fine. All right, I think you could fill that in. Same with Big Bang's not the basic outline is still there, but some really interesting things are happening. So there are a lot of specifics that it could hold. There are some big issues that it couldn't. The flip side, however, is the right side of the tree, which is the practical reason side. Okay. And so the eighth key idea, the little black dot behind me, offers a frame for what I call psychological mindfulness. The term, it's COM-MO is the frame, and that the MO is a metacognitive observer. Also stands for modus operandi, but it basically means you got to train this part of your consciousness, shift into metacognitive observer. Then you want calm body, calm mind, calm spirit. And by that, I mean your orientation toward the ultimate concern. Okay. And then it says, hey, there's an attitude that we're trying to cultivate through the calm, and that is curiosity, acceptance, loving compassion, and motivated toward valued states of being. And to the extent that we can do that, it says, hey, you'll be able to metabolize what happens so much in psychological neurosis is people get bumped, they get defensive, their body goes into polyvagal defense theory, they fight, they fawn, they freeze, they flee, okay? And then they justify why all that's happening, all right? In a mindless reactivity that tries to prevent whatever the threat is from activating. So COM-MO says, oh, okay, we are that way, we're primates. We tend to do that when bad shit happens, okay? And then also you bring that in, it's a balm for that, it reverses that, it allows that. So that's a embodied practice, psychological mindful psychotechnology, use John Vervaeke's thing. I don't think that it'd be hard for me to understand why that would go. That's basically a conceptualization of wisdom traditions and ways of being. So I think there'll be fruit to eat off the tree, even if some of it gets blown up. But yeah, it does have some truth commitments, no doubt. So.
In psychology, there's some tension or disagreement around whether psychology should be considered a science. And I'm thinking, for instance, of...
I haven't heard that.
Right, exactly. Like Bradford Keeney, who worked so long in family systems theory. Mm-hmm. And eventually he decided to move in the direction of regarding psychology as the youngest of the folk healing arts. Mm. And to really go back to try to root himself in the knowledge of indigenous cultures on how they process trauma, how they basically, communally support the transformation of the individual. Yep. And this is kind of an off-the-cuff question. It doesn't directly relate to stuff I've heard you talk about, but how do you navigate that kind of territory from within Utah or mm-hmm.
No, that's an unbelievably central question to me when I talk about defining psychology. It's right at the core. So for me, you enter into my language game. There is the metapsychology, or what I used to call my scientific humanistic philosophy, but now in talking to Zach Stein, over the last year and a half, I'm like, actually, I'll just call that a metapsychology. Okay, that's the space and connection between psychology and philosophy, basically. And I find it helpful to now, whether or not the one big question is, was that part of philosophy or psychology? Well, so let's at least say there's that position. And that position can simply be called, well, this is the interface that happens when humans become self-aware to go, what are we and what are the implications we are for what we ought to do? Which is pretty close to philosophy too, right? Just centered on philosophy of mind, ethics a little bit. It's got some other areas that is, philosophy concerns itself with, but so there you go. Okay. So if that is psychology for you, well, all right, that's one big way of thinking about it. What happens also that you have to contend with is what we mean by psychology in the modernist sense. I mean, psychology gets its character precisely because it tracks the emergence of physics, at least modern psychology. And then it says, we're going to play the language game of science and try to apply that to the world. Okay. So if you then in my estimation, if you're going to disconnect and you're just going to be, I'm going to be an indigenous healer, and I don't care too much about empiricism because I think that ruins people, great. It probably does, but you're not a psychologist anymore in my field, at least in a modern scientific sense. So, the psychology should not be applied to that any more than it should be applied to the shaman doing his thing right now. He's not a psychologist. Okay. So it has a particular character. It's a unique discipline. Some people say it's young. I don't buy that. I don't think that I think it's pretty old. Okay. I mean, in terms of modern science, how old is that? And there are a hell of a lot of really young disciplines, molecular biology, a lot younger than science, than psychology, doing very well as a science. Okay. I don't think it's our youth. I think we're just confused. So here's how I define, in fact, this was central to the tree of knowledge, is that you then there are three great branches of the field through my metapsychology. So as my metapsychology positions me, I then pull the tree of knowledge up and then say, okay, there are three great branches of psychology from the tree of knowledge metapsychology. All right. Those three great branches are as follows. At a scientific level, the first thing that it teaches you is psychology is profoundly confused by what it means by mental process, the science of mental process. And there are two radically different meanings. One exists at the animal mental dimension. Like, do we mean mental process the way in which it corresponds to the fish in my tank? Okay. Or do we mean human mental process? The way you and I are talking about stuff right now. Is that what is my subject matter? The fish in the tank and classical conditioning and operant conditioning and all of that. Okay. Or this conversation and how I feel about my wife. I mean, and the answer from my vantage point is there's basic psychology, which is comparative animal psychology, right? And that's what it should be. It's basically the science of mind, brain, animal behavior, which is a pure natural science, okay, and the foundation. And then you get human psychology. And then human psychology is the base of the human social sciences, which is a totally different discipline from the tree of knowledge vantage point, okay? And psychology doesn't do this at all. It doesn't break basic into human. All right. But both of those are concerned. The language game they're playing is to describe and explain what you see. It's a science. That's what science tries to do. Creates the thing that you're looking at as an it. It moves, and then you try to explain it. That's what scientists try to do. Okay. I'm a clinician. That's not what I do when somebody comes into my thing. Okay. I'm a healer, right? In my practice. So you come to me and you're like, oh my God, I just had a fight with my wife. I want to join with you. I care about your idiosyncratic world. And my whole goal isn't to describe and explain why you're an it. My goal is to connect to your soul and move you toward valued states of being and adaptation. Okay, I'm there to affect change in accordance with some humanistic value structure. Okay? That's what I define as psychological doctors and the profession of psychology. Okay, which is now, or health service psychology. These are the individuals that get trained to become licensed practitioners. And that's a totally other field in the way I define it. And that's clinical counseling school, licensed psychological doctors. So now you have my metapsychology, basic, animal, human, personality, developmental, cognitive, social. Okay, you have an applied stream here of like educational, sport, all that stuff. And then you have the psychological healer doctors who enter into the real and do value-based change, which is not a basic science game. That is a healer game, and that's a totally different field.
There's a kind of subtle tension in integral metatheory between co-present dimensions of reality and emergent layers of reality, because there's some kinds of overlap between the categories. So if we think on the one hand about, energy, matter, biology, the noosphere, with that kind of thing, there's also the sense that Vervaeke's kinds of knowing or Wilber's quadrants, where something like interiority and something like participatory relations and something like objects are always present at every level. So how do you relate emergent layers to co-present dimensions in your own thinking?
Brilliant. Yeah. So I do that through what I call the quadratic. Okay. So I love Wilber's quadrants, but I identify them as human epistemological quadrants. Okay. Meaning that these are frames upon which we achieve knowledge and justification. So upper interior, upper exterior, phenomenology and behavior, those are great epistemological frames of the inside now. Okay. And then we can drop down and we have cultural justifications. Hey, I often say from inside the garden, this is the world looks. Okay. If you tell me I'm insane, that's great. Most of you are standing outside of it. I would say I was insane if I was on the other side of this equation too. Okay. So So the inside the culture from the outside of the system, I love those quadrants. I find Wilber's framing, I have talked with Bruce a little bit about this. I'd love to, Bruce and I will have some more conversation down the road here about, I find some of Wilber's ontological framing and commitments to be raise some significant questions. I particularly don't like his upper right, okay, which I think he conflates a physicalist ontology, meaning he describes as though it's the brain, okay, with an exterior object level epistemology. Okay, I think he conflates that. The tree of knowledge says, yeah, don't conflate that. The tree of knowledge says an object exteriority is the lens of behavior, all right? But you need to take behavior on its own terms. Okay, so that right now, this conversation that we are having is operant at a culture person plane of existence, and we can record our behavior and my justifications for why I'm doing it, and anyone can watch that from an upper. I'm talking right now, and you don't watch my brain, you watch me behave as a unit. Okay, so what do I do? The quadrant is the epistemology. Then the quadratic refers to I am a physical object. Right? I've got to press on the chair at about 185 pounds, right? I'm surrounded by, and then we jump up. I'm a collection of cells. So that's my cell life, okay? Into my nervous system that then creates a collective experience somehow. We can talk about that. That gives rise to my phenomenological first person view. And then I'm translating that, feeding back, connecting with you through justification. So that's the culture person plane. And that just also aligns with the perennial philosophy, minus the great chain of being. I mean, this is Aristotle, at least on the outline form. So I have an ontology of the matter, life, mind, culture. That's happening. In the human level, we have these epistemological frames that we can shift back and forth. I wonder about spirituality, spiritual ontology. All I'm basically saying as a more conservative claim is I can align the naturalistic view between these epistemological frames and these ontological layers a lot clearer than we've been, and that's what I'm offering.
Since I mentioned Mark Edwards before, I'll bring him up here. He also complains about the upper right quadrant as overcrowded, overpacked with too many phenomena. And for him, one of the things that he suggests is adding another axis between energy and form. And he develops that in his own ways. But I was looking to talk to you also about some similarities and differences between UTOC and AQUIL, for instance. And in AQUIL, or integral psychology, there are considered to be at least, 6 fundamental elements: the quadrants, levels, lines, states, types, and the self system.
Yes.
Right. And looking at your system, I really see most of those things present. Some of them are part of the constitutive structure of your metatheory, and others are maybe phenomena that are just included in there. And so in integral theory, 2 elements that play a very strong role constructively, constitutively, are levels and also states.
Yes.
And thinking about your concerns about the spiritual ontology, I think that would probably relate to some reservations about the deployment of states in integral theory.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are possibly naturalistic and metaphysical ways to understand states that could be, I think, that could fly within UTOC.
Mm-hmm.
So we might
Absolutely
talk about that a little bit, but what's your take on the especially the place of levels and states within your system?
Absolutely. I haven't done the deep dive in, really lining up all of what Wilber is doing with the 6 primaries. Okay. And I actually do have some concerns about the whole type thing. Types are really tricky. Okay. I know you didn't ask about that, but I'll just say, I've been on my to-do list is to delineate this. And in fact, I'm working with Andre Marquis, who's an expert integral scholar, and we're both debating whether we want to do a dive into a joint book on integral unified, frames that would then really delineate this in some great detail. So let's just talk about, let's go into sort of the evolution of consciousness and culture that Wilber identifies, okay? Which I think is actually brilliant. I really do. I know there is a serious concern, and I think this has to be held, but it also has to be acknowledged, and how we hold it and acknowledge is really training. So the evolution of what we mean whenever we're going to create a hierarchy, okay, that's going to create tension, ego tension. It's like, oh, I want to be higher, boom, okay, now we're going to have issues. But so what I'm doing right now is I'm working with Lean Rachel Anderson, who I think has a really nice meta-modernity model. Okay, so she's in the meta-modern community. But basically, this is what she says, and then we can talk about sort of the Wilber-Coombs lattice and those kinds of elements and see where they would line up. But let's just start with some of the basics. So I think it's very, very sensible to talk about the evolution of human cultural consciousness, okay, and across 4 different phases. Right? That's going to line up in the Wilber system, I think, fairly clearly. Okay, I think Wilber's pre-trans modeling, so you're pre and then you're in the system and then you transcend that across many developmental lines. That's brilliant. Okay, it's a wonderful general thing. So I really like that. I appreciate the domains he applies that to. If we talk about just the basic cultural consciousness, I like the idea that originally we're an oral indigenous way of being. Okay, that's going to have some animism, some tribalism, obviously going to get spiral dynamics kind of rolled in here in a particular way. And just the idea of from the Utah or tree of knowledge, more specifically, idea is that what happens is humans, once they tip into propositional knowing, okay, we open up a line of communication that's radically different and develop these systems of justification. Okay, so now we're hunter-gatherers wandering around able to ask why the hell is things happening. Good luck figuring that out. Okay, at the level of real abstraction. So you're going to build a tribal, animistic way of understanding the world, or at least that's what tends to happen. And from my vantage point, it makes sense. I'm also going to say there's a powerful, powerful wisdom to be cultivated, okay, in this level of consciousness. And indeed, I think that one of the great, we're seeing Sandtalk, I'm going to blank on his name real fast, but the Sandtalk is now as an indigenous wisdom kind of return. I completely agree that there's a huge amount of wisdom we're losing from the oral indigenous perspectives. And one of the things that we need for the 21st century consciousness is an infusion of this. And this is, of course, going to be a nod also to Wilber's insights that we're talking about evolution of include and then transcend. Right? So then what you go from oral indigenous, you go into traditional. So the traditional, what happens to people is they start building civilizations. There's no way to maintain oral indigenous relations with people. Okay, the systems are too big. And you have to have then, you get experts, you get differentiation of skill sets, and you get the priests beginning to cultivate expert knowledge, and you get the kings that have to do things like Hammurabi's code. Okay, and now you have law and justification and what I would call the traditional formal cultural code of knowing. Okay, and then that happens first through the Bronze Age, and then the Bronze Age collapse. That's the first wave of it. Then you get Axial Age emergence of the great wisdom traditions that were still with us today, Confucianism, Hinduism. Then you get the evolution from the traditional pre-modern formal way of thinking into the modern scientific. Now we're clearly into orange here. And you get the modern scientific, individual, rational. Hey, we can transcend cultural things because we now have the scientific objective reasoning. Then you get green and you critique it, over the last 50 years. All of that to me makes very, very good sense. It's a wonderful heuristic. I think that, we can then get into states, and why people shift across states. And of course, I'm a clinician. If you're a clinician, you attend to states immediately, right? You don't see people ever as one thing. Okay, you have an observer yourself and be like, oh my God, with my students, I was great. I came home and my kids, I was shitty. I was like, I had problems, I'm not the same. Lots of different things will create massive fluctuations. So we can get into the idiographic. In fact, that's what Andre Marquis found, is that when integral theorists actually did psychotherapists, They were really totally focused on states as a major. But anyway, at the stages kind of thing, then you have that idea, oral indigenous, all the way to green. I'm blending, I know, around that. And then the position of, and I don't like the term second tier, I will say that, although I'm empathetic to it. I don't like second tier. I find second tier is basically poking the first tier people in the eye on their ego in a very, very strategically, erroneous place. You got to hold the ego. Don't we know that? Just say, actually, we broke the ego and I know that. Mine got broken, but now I'm free. And you're going to react against me because you're paradigmatically, frozen and lesser. Okay. It's just is a very, very dangerous way. So because it's, even though there's a lot of things that when I get around integral people, I can be like, yeah, I'll truth that. But, it's like how it's framed. So include, transcend across the evolution of cultural consciousness. Steve McIntosh, he does that with developmental politics. He doesn't include the oral indigenous, but he includes the traditional, the modern, the postmodern, recognize strengths, weaknesses of each, demonstrate a cultural consciousness that actually weaves that together, creates a collective that does that. I think we owe Wilbur a whole bunch on that. And I think that there's a huge amount of truth and value in that.
Yeah, I've tended to lean toward models in which the integrative or meta dimension or the second tier is more orthogonal to each of the stages rather than a leap beyond them. I think we've got a big role for something like a new shamanism, in that in terms of a wisdom tradition that's ecologically focused, embodiment focused, left, right, balanced, and oriented towards people taking more responsibility for state change.
Brilliant.
And I've tended to argue that states might have a basic onto-epistemological basis. And I think that's one way of unpacking the upper right quadrant, right? Because we get this over-association with physical material and objects. But if you add in different potential ontologies, then you say, well, the objects aren't all physical. This is a zone of looking at things or targeting it-like phenomenon,
right.
But it's not the same as 17th century empirical materialism.
Totally. And I'll say and I'm not a meditator. I'm intensely psychologically mindful. I do minor meditation. So Wilbur has access, and everybody that does this has access to the witnessing conscious function of the upper left in ways that, I'm very elaborate on my logos, but as the Tao says, the Tao ain't the Tao. It's, and the presencing what I believe that we need to recapture, what I believe that many oral indigenous, wisdom shaman traditions will capture, is the cultivation of that witnessing function and the centering of it and mastery of it and the opening of it and all of that. Of course, psychology practice people are discovering that with mindfulness. And it has its value, although it can become mindfulness, and it's a dangerous thing to just okay now just it's like, oh god, it's like help us. But if we can actually do that with authenticity, the modernist empirical natural science system killed our what I would call our pathic essence of being, meaning underneath our first person experience, and of course all the wisdom teachers said, hey, actually being with that being is pretty important for us to be sane and get along.
Along the line of states, I'm intrigued by the spiritual or contemplative dimension of metatheory building, and I wonder what your felt relationship is to the moments of consilience and mega inclusion when you behold them or when you birth them. What's that like? That state?
It's wisdom energy, man. It is, it is my calling. And when it happens, as people know around me, it's like, I get cell activation. Okay? So it's a cellular activation. I'm raised in the new atheist tradition. My father, who was more present in philosophy of our family, was originally an evangelical for a while, and then actually had a conversion in young adulthood. And then over an 8-year period, he almost is ordained as a minister. The light goes out, and he becomes a history professor. And then we grow up with, oh my God, it's actually science. It's not Christ, it's science. Okay. And sort of a Dawkins-esque view of Christianity. And so I'm modern empirical natural science guy in terms of what, and thus I'm spiritually impoverished, essentially, is another way of saying that. Okay. It's through ultimately the tree of knowledge discoveries that I rediscover what it means to be connected to the universe in a particular way, and what that means at the level of every fiber of your being. And so the times in which I go through my phases of, my wife sometimes calls me a knowledge archaeologist, when I discover a new gem, okay, and I see what it brings. It's a oneness experience. In fact, I have a thing called an I-quad coin that has one on one side of it. And there's a oneness there that connects to the self, to the universe. And it is very powerful. And it's so powerful, even, I've had empirical experiences, both, and I don't mean anecdotal. There's a singularity, you may have heard of singularities term around. But there's a Russian mathematician, a big history. This is in the world of big history, is the singularity, this idea that there's another threshold. They have 8 thresholds, threshold number 9. Some people talk about it as a singularity. I talked about it as a singularity, so I call the 5th joint point, which is what comes after culture as the digital world emerges. Okay. Well, there is a Russian mathematician who looked at the evolution of complexity. Okay. On a quantifiable measure, and he found Westerners were doing it one way, like Ray Kurzweil. And then there's this whole Russian tradition of tracking the evolution of complexity as a totally different data set. All right. And you see these lines and they cross, one of them crosses with a correlation. He uses a super simple formula, crosses with correlation like 0.994 in 2027. And another crosses and he comes vertical at 2029. All right. This is my now, like, I see God. This is sort of like in math and in the evolution of complexity. It's like, oh, how is that possible? Here I'm sitting, 2028, there's a singularity emerging. I'm feeling it. This is like a mathematical phenomenon of the universe, So for me, absolutely. I still consider that a pure metaphysical claim, meaning I don't know what it means at all. In fact, the critique of it is like, oh, it's metaphysical historicity. And I was like, I'll take that. That's exactly what it is. Let's make the future history and have fun with it, and allow you to have some faith, and also be grounded. So I've grown enormously, and I consider myself a naturalist and a spiritualist. I'm very clear about what I consider to be the horizon of metaphysics grounding. But the idea that there's a calling there, I feel that at many levels. And the idea of an ultimate concern, all of that stuff lines up with me profoundly. And, at a core energy level, it certainly, I feel it.
I think we're all in good company here. I think we all have that feeling of that glimpse of the mandalic vision that just, brings all things together, at least for that moment.
Right. That's a super important point to anybody. Listen, it's a state phenomenon.
Yes.
Okay. If it becomes a trait phenomenon, you're going insane. You're going to blow all the circuits.
Exactly.
We'll have to lock you up. Sorry.
I mentioned this to you in email, I think, but I think it connects to what you're talking about now with the anticipation possibly of singularity. And Jeremy Rifkin has this idea in his book, Empathic Civilization, about the leaps that civilizations have made historically. And I relate what he's talking about as a subset of your basic idea of joint points, that at each major level of the unfolding of life, of actually the universe, there's a joint point, which is a point at which new capacities become available that allow for the emergence of a new form of being. And for him, within the human historical frame, what needs to happen is the convergence of new forms of communication and new forms of energy production and sharing.
Yes.
And when those come together, that basically provides the scaffolding for the next level of a civilizational order.
Totally.
And he feels we're at the edge of that now, especially we've got the communication system with the internet.
Yep.
And, we're waiting in a sense for the next emergent energy regime
Yep.
that will help provide, some foundation for that next shift.
Right.
And so, I just wanted to check in with you on how you feel about that. And I want to ask you two things, but I'll come back to the other one later. But
Okay.
for this first one, between the joint point and Rifkin's civilizational stage account.
Totally. So yes, I think that I love Zach Stein's with Time Between Worlds. Okay, so that's another angle on this. That we're in some sort of phase change shift. Another, John Vervaeke, the axial age kind of transformation is needed. If we ground this in the basic logic of the tree of knowledge, as I've told many people under various 6 weeks, I don't remember exactly, 6 weeks to 6 months, which was in 1997, after I generated the tree of knowledge, I had the insight that the 21st century was going to be huge. Okay. And the reason is clear if you follow the language of the joint points. Okay. Especially from matter to life to mind, and life and mind to culture. Once you get to what are those cones and why do different planes of complex adaptive existence emerge, and what do we mean by them and what manifests them? And the short answer is that they are complex arrangements of energy information flow that are then held together by new forms of information processing and communication. Okay, that provides the fundamental structure that allows the energy to flow through the system to fend off the second law of thermodynamics and gather the free energy to then get metabolized. And you need the information to detect that and suck it up and then move it through. That's what cells do. And then nervous system does that for the animal. Okay, so it's like the DNA nucleus of the animal, the brain. Then all of a sudden we figured out how to talk. Okay, so now you have a talking new information processing communication system. So then you get culture person. Now you looked out at the end of the 20th century where I was at the time, and you just asked, well, is there an emerging information processing communication network system? As I typed to people on the internet. And it's like, oh, yeah, okay, right? So now we're laying down the information processing communication system, which allows, think about what it does like in space-time, energy, information, communication, like this, all of a sudden we're in all these different places, and now we all come together in the virtual space, and the adjacent possibilities that this opens is just, unspeakably enormous. It opens up a whole nother world. The energy thing is now we have to actually transform the work energy into the system. So you get this information processing communication system, we have that. We're still polluting the crap out of the planet in a horrifying way. So we have to figure out how to pull the free energy right without all the externalities that kill the planet. If we could, people are obviously, we're working on that. And then the last piece for me is, well, then there's what is wisdom, basically. Okay. So then the wisdom is the theory and practice of valued states of being that allows us to make sense and be in relation. And if we get our information processing communication systems, the energy flow systems, and the wisdom together, you then would actually enable the upgrade and the distribution and the system, the Titanic towards the iceberg transitions and sails off into a sustainable way of being that addresses, we awaken from the meaning crisis, we address the mental health crisis, we address the environmental crisis, and we realize that, man, if we love wisdom energy together, we'll be a lot better off than we currently are now.
Two things. First, I want to thank you for mentioning Lenny Rachel Anderson, who I correspond with regularly. She's contributing to the Meta Modern anthology that I'm co-editing, but I didn't even think of including her on this series. So I want to say this to Bruce. We absolutely should try to get her on.
Definitely.
Second thing is, where does your model building and metatheorizing go next? What would are there outstanding problems? Are there things you want to integrate to make it a more adequate theory? What's its next iteration?
Right. The next iteration then is the pragmatic translation. That's what I'm in the process of. And actually over the last 2 weeks, and I mentioned it a couple of times because my mind is still I'm a little hypomanic, okay? Because over the last 2 weeks, I hooked onto this concept called wisdom energy. All right. I never put those concepts together in the exact way that I've done recently. And the process by which I did that has unfolded some really exciting things for me. And when I find that, that's me in my little state of, oh, I caught another one. That's great. At least I have to metabolize it and see if it really works. That will take a month or so. So I'm about halfway through that. But the reason partly that I'm really excited about it is because I see the pathway of the kind of change that I've always needed to make. Okay. So my system, it's like, 1997, I fall into a rabbit hole of analysis. It's heavy on logos. I mean, it really is concerned. It's playing the modern empirical natural science language game in its own terms. I mean, it doesn't do anything other than, okay, I want to analyze this. I want to understand this. I want to pull all this stuff together. And I made a couple of really foundational lateral shifts, first with the justification and then into the tree of knowledge. And then by myself built this whole thing that is it creates a whole language game that's very difficult for people to follow. Okay. Especially when I still was attached to my ego and was still in the process of being like, so I was just basically saying, here's this justification system is like a meta-systemic theorist tends to be in my little autistic world of like, oh God, this is truth as long as everybody plays this language game. And of course people are like, well, screw you, I like my language game. It's like, but I'm telling you, you'll see the light. Okay. I'm a clinician, thankfully, so I get to avoid that often. I know how to step outside of that. So I'm holding both of those in my head. But I never really, even my doc students and everything else, the ability to translate this language to them so that they speak it fluently. They can speak it with me, but then the idea of speaking it with other people and speaking with other people when critiques emerge in relationship to it, so you understand what the critique is, it's like only I can do that. Okay. So super frustrating because now you're like sitting on this thing and you don't know how to spread it. And that's always been, and I got called in 2015, 16 to turn it into this garden thing. Okay. Which in retrospect, it's a meta-modern artwork of sincere irony. I didn't know that at the time. It was so fascinating to be called into something. My dad, as a modernist academic, Gregg, your theory's already weird, called the tree of knowledge. Now you turned it into a tree in a garden. He's a Dawkins-esque new atheist. He's not very pleased with that narrative. It's like, what are you doing? It's like, I don't know, but I'm called to it. And actually, I do know, Dad, but one day I'll be able to tell you maybe. But the whole point of it is like, there has to be a journey to figure out how to get to the other side and share it with people so that it then is seeded in others and then grows from within. All right? That's where my phase is. That's what I'm after. Right now, what's hot for me is this idea of, can we cultivate Okay, can we cultivate wisdom energy? All right? I like that. Notice that's a question. Okay. Forrest Landry, operates in these circles, was on still a little while ago. He's connected to like Zach Stein, and he developed this ephemeral group process. He's grounded in immanent metaphysics. He's got a really fascinating system. I'm still in the process of learning. But ephemeral group process is fundamentally oriented first and foremost around question generating, which I totally respect. I, of all people, know that it's justification relative to question. Justification makes a claim, which then positions the opposite. Okay. And so justifications, which I couldn't find any other way other than just, well, here it is, and then deal with it or not. It's now like, and I get to the backside of that and be like, can we cultivate wisdom energy that hits people's intuition in the right way, draws them forth, okay, and then invites them at the appropriate zone of proximal development to start, metabolizing, that doesn't create a dominance, ego, insistence, learn the system, all of that. So my hope is that if the system can find its way to be oriented that way, well, then the translation can happen. So that's where I am, and that's what my hope is, and that's what the questions we will see.
It may only be a convergence of vocabulary, but I feel like there could be something further there when I'm thinking about McIntosh's notion of value energy and the metabolizing process of orienting towards fundamental value. So I think that could be a kind of technology for generating a wisdom energy.
Yes. Well, actually, so I historically defined wisdom as theory and practice toward valued states of being. That's essentially. I got hooked in because there was an Aeon article on the science of wisdom. Like just this past week, John Vervaeke was part of the Toronto work. And basically they're like, it's metacognition anchored to some fundamental appreciation for value that's flexibly applied. And I was like, ooh, that is what I mean when I talk about wisdom. So that was a really nice sinking. That was part of the intersection of the hook. And so, yeah, and I talked to Nick Jankel just yesterday or the day before, and his wisdom leadership. And he was like, oh my God, you had wisdom energy leadership, and boom, there was just popping there. So that's the kind of thing where lots of people can contribute and bring stuff alive. And then it's not specified, so it calls to grow, but it's constrained enough so it's in the right direction. I'd love to hear the connection of Steve McIntosh. Actually, having read his book, I hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right. 100%. Excellent, brilliant connection.
I had mentioned I wanted to connect to one other thing, and so I'll make that thread connection before we go too far along. Just thinking about the tree of knowledge system and the joint points and the cones, and then I was talking about Rifkin and his civilizational stages, which is also basically founded on this notion of these joint points and cones. And Wilber, actually, with his fulcrum model of psychology, does that for the different stages with this ladder climber view model and the different fulcra of development. So it's like a macro, meso, and micro
nice
patterning of the same kind of movement. Yep. And I wondered if you had maybe some insight into the dynamics of the joint points of the tree of knowledge that relate or translate to that movement within the micro level that Wilber is tracking of the unfolding from, the aerobic and then, pre-operational and all of those different stages.
Totally. So let's stay with there's emergence within a joint point. Okay. So you got to get from the bottom of mind to the top of mind. Okay. So there's within dimension emergence, and then there's the big dimensional shifts between the dimensions. Okay. So if we want to first hone in on what the big dimensional differences are between, and why actually I believe we're at the big dimensional difference here on the fifth joint point. So, and then what are those features? Okay. So, and then we can talk about also what are the leveling ups that take place within, and then we can think about them, from different angles. So I just want to make a distinction between like the big shift and a within shift. Okay. So what are the elements that go into the big shifts as far as I'm concerned? Well, I already hit on some: information processing and communication. Okay. But those things need to also be channeled into a complexity building feedback loop. All right. That's appropriately constrained, but structured to generate what Stuart Kaufman calls the adjacent possible. Okay. In other words, an entirely new landscape that then has enough constraints on it, but then enough feedback so that it grows. Okay. So you get an information processing cell that can communicate. It's not going to go anywhere. It just dies unless it replicates. Okay. And then there's a selection process so that it then generates. Okay. So you get a feedback loop. Variation, selection, and retention is the constrained complexity building feedback loop, all right, that then causes the level up. The argument, and one of the things that I saw, is that the life to mind shift, B.F. Skinner's operant theory, okay, operant selection, reinforcing from the outside, allows for an environmental selection process, really an animal agent environmental selection process, which actually B.F. Skinner called commerce, okay, initially, meaning the animal spends its energy, the environment either gives you return on the energy in a particular way, and to select it, and then you retain in memory, although he wouldn't use this term, but basically you retain how does it select? Skinner never really asked that, and the cognitive neuroscientists can answer that. It says, oh, it stores memory and process it, right? So you have an information processing and environmental selection feedback loop, okay? Then you go up, and the argument is that language then gets captured and constrained into the systems of justification. In other words, the constraints then are what's legitimate, what's not, and the various is-ought propositional dynamics that then allow for a constraining system of paradigms to be built that justify. So you get information processing communication, but they actually have to be constrained in particular ways. Okay. So now we get into this process about, well, where are we and what kind of constraints that we need? And I'm arguing that the core is the energy flow. So you have to pull free energy rate density off the flow. All life, mind, culture has to do that. We'll have to continue to do that. Okay. The emergence information processing system in communication is the digital. But what's dangerous is as digital arises, it's going to cause the lower levels to go crazy because there's not enough constraints that allow the proper jump into the holding. Okay. And what are those constraints? Well, for me, the answer basically is wisdom. Okay. So wisdom, and this was the whole idea, is like, well, you have digital. Okay. We built knowledge system in really scientific knowledge, but scientific knowledge undercuts wisdom. Right? Wisdom fundamentally is a metacognitive, value-grounded state. It's trans culture, really. It's the process by which people become sages in versus conventional thinking. And then the question is, if you can sync up the sages, all right, that's value-grounded and cultivate energy information through there, you then create a metacultural consciousness. Okay, that's the way the term I use, which, by the way, lines up nicely because we want to channel energy to MC squared, just capital. Metacultural consciousness. Have fun with that one. Okay, so and then the art idea is that what are the theory and practices of valued states of being that we can bring together? And I offer exhibit A of our political system as how not to do it. Okay, so look at the United States, look at the current political system, and just you want people to regress into teams that are unbelievably competitive and narcissistic and manipulative and completely defined as I am good and you're bad, and we're going to compete against you and lie and manipulate, all anti-wisdom. I mean, this is my whatever I can do political, but I look at Trump relative to the concept of wisdom. I'm like, ooh. So we're going to flip it, and then. If the wisdom systems can sync, then you create through the ecologies. Okay, I talk about gardens at the Bronfenbrenner ecological scale. So gardens in my soul, gardens with my family, okay, gardens in my community, gardens in the state, gardens in the nation, gardens transnationally into globally. And if you have wisdom anchor through those elements, then you have the proper constraints that can shape the emergence of energy information and to a sustainable, complex, adaptive plane.
I would also be interested to see how the notion of wisdom energy unpacks itself relative to McIntosh's value energy. When I talked to McIntosh last about value energy, I ended up writing an article which was a Nietzschean recapitulation of his notion. You could anchor it in the will to power in a post-metaphysical universe and get the same pattern he was describing. He's half open to that argument, but I'd love to see how that applies to whatever argument you might come up with that links those two together. I'm intrigued. Yeah. Now, my question is totally unrelated to that, more along the lines of what Bruce was just saying. The way that Wilber tried to unify psychology involved these fulcrums and the idea that distinct schools of psychology evolved to address imbalances and pathologies arising at these transition points, at these joints. What do you think is the common element of pathology at all the joints, which is also a way of asking, what do you think health means in its most general sense?
Great. Yeah. So this is, again, so you're touching me right at the psychological doctor level. So the seventh branch of the tree, the one with a red circle on it, is called the nested model of well-being. And it tackles essentially the descriptive problem of what do we mean by well-being? Okay, because people use that in a wide variety of different domains. So there's one angle is, we have to get clear on what well-being in general is, and then what are the biological, psychological, social dimensions of that well-being. And so there's that. Okay, so life, mind, and culture will actually give you a frame, and then it says, yes, there are ways to think about well-being in the biological, psychological, and social. Let's then hone in on human psychology now, because you also then reference Wilber's point and about, well, what goes wrong. Okay, and the first thing I want to do is I want to note that what often goes wrong is at the level of psychology, not at the level of biology, people. Okay, the only reason that everything has to be biological is because psychiatry is the big institutional dog, and that's one of the medical disciplines, and they have to fix broken biology. And I love psychiatrists. I don't like psychiatry all that much. Okay, and so they're committed institutionally to fixing broken biology. Or they then try to become the dominant health discipline and adopt biopsychosocial medicine like George Engel did, but then actually you're now just a health profession writ large. In fact, the best profession for that is actually nursing, by the way. Nurses should be the actual leaders of the World Health Organization, not physicians. But anyway, I've got women's knowledge. Okay. At the human psychological level, what you basically get you get dukkha, which is entrapped maladaptive patterns of ways of being and thinking, okay, that then suck people in to channels of investment that have short-term benefits in their context, okay, because they're trying to manage energy flow in a particular way. And then you get long-term consequence, but you're stuck with them, and then you double down. All right. Now, the fifth branch on the tree is called character adaptation systems theory. Okay. It is the bridge, it's the fifth branch, so now we start to move into psychotherapy in the world of that. What it says is that at the center of human psychology are these systems of adaptation. Okay? In other words, what you're trying to do is you're trying to adjust the person-environment, human-environment relation. Okay? And the systems of adaptation go from base to more increasingly complicated. The base system is your habit system. Okay? So the habit system, it just basically builds procedural memories after experience. It has particular ingrained reflexes that it lines up and then builds procedural memories on classical and operant conditioning. And then you just program them. And then they'll get triggered by certain things. And then it will orient you to do something if you're used to doing it. And if you can't do it, it will give a craving and it will irritate you if you don't. For example, if you're a drinker. Okay. So if you get used to 5 o'clock coming home, right? And every day you come home and part of the release of getting home is going over to the cabinet and popping the vodka. As soon as you start to do that, you're like, thank you, right? I'm ready. And then if you decide, no, I'm not going to do it today, then by 5:30, you're like, your system, you got to release that habit. And then you got to get the jolt because we're dependent on it. Okay. And then what it does is that it moves you up a system into your experiential system, which is the base of your phenomenology. Okay. Which organizes and integrates your perceptions, your motives, and your emotions. It's mostly organized by perceptions, and motives, and emotions. And that creates basically what you're trying to, this is John's perspectival and participatory knowing. Okay. So this then is your experiential system. And this is the core, it's affectively organized so that when you do like psychotherapy from an emotion-focused neo-humanistic perspective, you're really tracking the foundational organization of that phenomenological center and how it's an organismic valuing process, okay, from a humanistic level, that if it's cultivated right in a non-judgmental sort of way with proper constraints that the humanists didn't always put on it, but if you give them that, then you can cultivate that. That's the center of that valuing process is going to be actually the root of much health. Okay. Then you move up. So now that's the experiential system. Then you move up to what's called the relationship system. In fact, I'm going to be talking with John Vervaeke today about this. Okay. The relationship system then goes from a one animal psychology into a two animal psychology where you're then tracking self-other relation. It is evolutionary grounded in attachment, meaning mother offspring is where it starts. That's where you really actually have to empathize and relate. And then the social animals get competition and cooperation and then track their place in social influence and hierarchies, relational value. And we have this whole machinery to determine where we are in social space. Okay. What we're hoping to get is we're hoping to have the alignment of good social influence and being known and valued, what I call high relational value social influence, high RVSI. And that means the others know you authentically and they value you and you can influence them and you're yoked together. The reverse is low value, low social influence state. Okay. And that's a threat state, and you want to attend to that. So these three: habit, experiential, relational, and these are things that we would share with other primates. Okay? There are two others. I'll jump to the last. The last is your system of justification, your justification system. This is the talking system that comes online when you're about 2, and then builds your narrative so that you become socialized. So that people ask you, well, why'd you do what you do? And who are you? Okay? And it's your propositional knowing system. And then the final system, which is really 4 in the name, is called the defensive system. The defensive system is the relationship between your self-conscious system and your animalistic systems. Okay? And then that system is trying to regulate your equilibrium between what your animal wants, what your private narrator wants, and what the social world wants. Okay? So what happens to people is they get trapped into entrenched maladaptive patterns across these systems of adaptation. And then as they get trapped, they feel enormous frustration, fatigue, discouragement, anxiety. They do that intrapsychically and interpersonally. Okay. And then you get to me. You get to come and see me. And as a clinician, I'm like, okay, I'm going to ask you all sorts of questions. And I'm tracking your habit system, your experiential system, your relationship system, your defense and identity across your history in the current context and what you want to do. Okay. And then I'll get into, these are the ways in which you've been trapped. And the ideal optimal functioning is a developmental trajectory that allows that heart and the habits to keep yourself healthy. Okay, and allow power to procedurally enact in the world. And then your heart as an organismic valuing process through your true relational self into a narrator that says, yes, this is aligned, into a relational world that knows and values you for what you are. Okay, you show me people like that and you ain't in my office.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great overview. And I have a question which might cover some of the territory again, but hopefully from a little bit different angle. And that is the integral model of psychology not only kind of maps out the field, it actually in practice will lead to different manifestations in actually how you sit with a client. There are the externals where you use the quadrants and other things like Andre Marquis, where you can use, for the intake and all of that. But there are also, I think, insights from the model that impact how you are together with the client and what you're looking for, what you're doing, working with states in order to help individuals step outside of their embedment in a particular problematic, constellation of associations or things, or using perspectives to be able to track where the cognitive and emotional fixations are in terms of how they're organizing their meaning making. And so there are just different ways that it will bleed into that context, even though you're not talking, theory wonkish language to them and all of that, but right. It's a perfume, and it actually maybe also unfolds in the forms of certain techniques or modes of intervention. So sure. Have you found in developing this that it's impacted your way of being with clients? And are there any maybe unique clinical manifestations?
Yeah, I mean, so this is what I do in terms of, so I'm hired and directed in a combined integrated doctoral program, training psychological doctors since 2003. So I train people to be psychological doctors. So the unified theory then is the backdrop for that. So the short answer, it just sort of weaves through basically everything. What I do then, I translate that there are 4 major psychotherapy traditions at the individual level. Okay, you have behaviorism, you have the humanistic tradition, you have the psychodynamic, okay, and versus psychoanalytic, and we can talk about my relation. I have a love-hate relationship with the psychoanalytic people. I'm syncing up with Cadell Last, who is a psychoanalytic philosopher, and I love it. It's great. But as a psychological scientist, me and Freud at certain places go, But anyway, psychodynamic is brilliant. That's my term for, and I love psychodynamic in its place. But in the science world, then there's definitely, you have to know what the language game it's playing is. So I offer that caveat. And then there's the cognitive and also lesser but important narrative and existential versions. Okay. The argument basically is that these different paradigms have key insights on patterns of maladaptation, okay, behaviors, okay, basically track the procedural habit system and the way the environment selects these kinds of issues and then develops ways to control the contingencies and cultivate new skills. This can be done brilliantly, or can be done, all of these then can be done brilliantly or poorly. The neo-humanistic place that focuses on the experiential systems, like Les Greenberg and his emotion-focused therapy. Modern psychodynamic theorists like Paul Wachtel. I was trained for 4 years at the University of Pennsylvania. I worked with Aaron Beck. He's one of the fathers of cognitive psychotherapy. So basically what I would say to you in terms of how does it, so you come into and the first thing I want to know is this sort of, if we're doing therapy, right, is I want a relational participatory dance implicitly so that you feel like I care, which I will, because I haven't been burned out that much. Okay? I care about you and your unique pathic way of being, your unique subjective organismic valuing process. Okay. And there's a relational field between us where you're tracking that and I'm tracking that in a dance. All right? And so then as a professional psychologist, it's key for me to send you the signals that you are valued, okay, and that you're known sort of initially developmentally in the way you want to be known, okay, which can vary, right? Like you don't want to be fully known right away. Right? So then our relational dance is essentially finding how do we do that? Okay? And this is the therapeutic relation. And then I just start to listen to your justification narrative. When I say, hey, what brings you in today? Okay. That's your justification narrative of self, the world, my past, my feared future, my angst, etc. Okay. And as I hear that, I'm hearing then the narrator who's willing to share with me then through the private into the public. So it's filtered. Who's this goddamn psychological doctor guy? Right? That's what you're like. Who is this guy? And what the hell do I really want to tell him? Okay. So that's the filter. And then I hear the themes of the practices and your habits and your lifestyle, making it real simple, your emotions and emotion functioning, your interpersonal style, which I'm tracking here, and your relational world, which you tell me, well, my dad, my mom, this were the family I was born in, these are the friends that I had, this was my first wife, and we blew up this way, whatever, right? Whatever the story's person is. And then I'm getting their relational field, and then I'm asking questions to see how that narrator justifies all of that, and where is it stuck? What's the stuckness in relation? And then how do we create the proper relational participatory element at the level so that the harmony is there in the dance, and then we have to build the conceptualization, the story of you, your problem, your history, and your potential. That's the conceptualization. Okay, and it's building that shared conceptualization that puts the framing, the constraints, and the hopes on the growth processes. And then that evolves into the actual tasks of psychotherapy, which people almost always get wrong, by the way. Is that they're like, oh, what do I need to do? Well, sit there, usually. Okay, I mean, the wisdom traditions sort of get this, like, awareness and acceptance are the 2/3 of it. Okay, or it's like, well, there are 4 things you need to do. Yeah, if it were that simple, you wouldn't be here, right? Okay. So that's and then the tasks. And so the tasks then are then you create feedback loops of outcome, and then you track all that. COM-MO, by the way, that is the 8th branch I mentioned it briefly in terms of curiosity. That is the principles and processes that I'm guiding, that guide my attention to the predominant socio-emotional maladaptive patterns that people get trapped into, and that is an overarching set of principles and processes for reversing those patterns.
So we've got these maladaptive patterns, which I think to some degree resemble primitive patterns in the way that a maladaptive modernity starts to look like a theocratic authoritarian medievalism, right? There's a kind of a regressive element to maladaptive patterns.
I love it. Brilliant.
But there's also this element where you mentioned this, a lot of maladaptive patterns are characterized by short-term investments with problematic long-term consequences. And that leads me to the question of time and how we relate to time, right? And, what's your ontology of time? How do you think time operates in your theory building? And psychologically, what's the basis of us all having a better relationship with time?
All right.
Easy question.
Right, the old time question. Yeah. Okay. So for me, we're on the cusp of the past turning into the present, turning into the future. We're on a wave of probability. Okay. So that's where, and that probability is when the probable, future. As I ride the crest of the wave of probability, I look out onto the sea of the wave possibility and back onto the sea of effect. Okay, so the sea of effect is where that wave of probability is happening to become the past. Okay, and so we're on this causal wave. So and then the angle in relationship to you looking at that, you look at as a psychological person, okay, that has a sphere of what the present is from our vantage point. That's one angle. That's very different than a quantum mechanical view of time. Okay, subatomic particle, the differentiation of quantum mechanical time, and that frame of reference is, well, qualitatively, quantitatively different. Okay, it's also the case that the sense of time at each level and dimension in the tree of knowledge, there's different space-time dimensions, basically. Okay, so Planck time means something at the floor of the system. That may, at least within some sort of scale. A Planck time at the level of psychology, even worse at the level of sociology, it means nothing. Okay, so things are happening in different frames at different places, and we have to be absolutely keen about that. And we have to be, I'll say, I hope we have the time, okay, for the developmental change. And often you hear me say the developmental change. So one of the first things you learn as a psychotherapist is you do not go from 0 to 100. You have to go from 10 to 20 to 30 in what's called the zone of proximal development. Okay, so we need, if the iceberg's 5 years out, we're doomed. Right? There's no way that the collective wisdom awakening can happen, and because of the structure of the system, and not only that, as it's regressing. Okay, so 5 years is not much in globalization time, and one of the things that's crazy making for us is things are changing so fast when we need paradigmatic evolution over time, and things are happening way too fast. So the time scale relation of the concept of how it operates, of what we were talking about, obviously people's things like geologic time. Those are all, so that's what I would offer. If you wanted to, again, get into what I've gotten into, quantum entanglement stuff, I've gotten into, general relativity. I have things to say about those relationships with sort of what the physical conceptions of time inside of a system versus hyper time and global time on the outside of a system. Those are fascinating questions. I'm expert on the cutting edge of sort of the metaphysics of time, but I enjoyed a lot of conversations about that. It's funky, as also, as time and energy, those are some of the deep ones. And I love those conversations. So is that in the ballpark of, is there any specifics that I'd be happy to follow?
Yeah, that's great. The only thing maybe you could add something in about is what's going forward, what's a more optimal psychological relationship with time? Because a lot of the wisdom traditions try to put us in an emotional state where we can use our prefrontal cortex in certain ways to manage future outcomes better than we might otherwise do. And, to have more foresight, to try to have effects that reach longer into time, in effect, to take the future at greater scales more seriously than we habitually do.
Beautiful. I mean, that's, as you climb up sort of the expanse of the ego, Confucius is very explicit about this, but others, you transcend and you extend right across time. And I wish that we would do that. And so I think that, for me, one of the things I often tell people is that you have a primary process system that does work in the immediacy, and you have a secondary. Anybody that works in addiction will know this. Or if put in more common terms, if you've ever dieted or tried to do anything self-disciplinary, right? You're like, when you're on that Monday morning and your narrator that's out here 1 week above or 2 months out, it's so easy to be like, well, I'm going to do this. Because the state system of the elephant or the horse or whatever the animalistic is like, fine, I just ate last night. I just drank last night. I'm good. I'm on board, right? And then, Friday afternoon is like, I was on board, but I'm now hungry and thirsty and want to have my drink. And then it pushes you. So, your primary system as an animal system, okay, operates in time in a radically different way, okay, than your secondary system. And this is one of the things that get people really tripped up. So you have to understand that you are operating in time in different ways. So that's one thing. The state vision will tell you that time is cyclical. Okay, remember I said, I feel it in my cells. I learned a long time ago that you feel that, and if you try to stay there, and especially as a clinician, I get to see that, you're going to go from hypomania to mania, and then you're going to short out, and you're doomed, right? So the idea that you can create some utopic, euphoric, consistent state that you don't have appreciation for the cycle of time, right? I mean, the seasons, for the love of God. Indigenous people know this in ways that we lose track of. I wish that we could then figure out the proper relation between past, present, and future. Okay, I think that's a very trauma of the past is really key. That's a get into trauma and what my orientation about it is. COM-MO, one of the things about, you mentioned, so COM-MO, the second word is acceptance, all right? And I really then fall into issues of detachment, distress tolerance, those are sort of Western psychological then bridges into the authentic wisdom traditions of, Zen Buddhism or whatever. But whatever would then orient you towards your capacity for presence and being, okay? But I'm also a Westerner, so I do also think then about in terms of, well, I want to be better. M is motivated toward valued states of being. So for me, what this does is it then positions you from being into becoming and to create that, okay? And then I want to create it across socioecological scale with the appropriate time, meaning from individual to dyad in small group, to community, et cetera, okay? And then so we're going to try to then create a developmental transition appropriate to scale, holding our animal and head, okay, around being and becoming.
I'm a longtime practitioner of a tradition called TSK instead of TOK,
okay.
Focusing on the time, space, and knowledge as fundamental orientations and elements of the world, orientations towards and elements of the world, and looking at how the constellation of the play of our experience and conception of time, our experience and conception of space, and our relationship to knowing and knowledge all work together in different ways to establish different patterns of the self system.
Wow, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so it's a topic I love, and actually maybe we can talk about it in the future.
I'd be super curious to learn about that.
Right now, I have time bearing down on me. I actually have to make the room available to someone else.
Okay.
So,
okay.
But I've loved the conversation. I wanted to ask if there's anything else, about the UTalk or the TOK that you'd like to share and add to our conversation before we bring it to a close.
Well, I mean, first, let me just say thank you. I appreciate you guys are great. We should hang. Really enjoyed it. I mean, wonderful, just rich questions, just hitting in exactly the kinds of things that I've wrestled with for a long time. So it's so fun to have interlocutors that actually, know the kind of angles to take on these kinds of metasystemic perspectives and to be able to allow an opportunity to see how it's flowered in various ways. It's been a really, really joy to share it with you. And I love the space that you guys are creating here. It's one of the wisdom, information, energy places that I hope we see flower more of. And that's the kind of thing, in my estimation, that is collects people together, allow in an integrated, pluralistic, wise way of being. And let's hope to try to do that. Because I don't know how much time we have. And hopefully we have enough. And if we do it, the back half of this century could be a beautiful thing. That's what I believe.
Amen.
This has been
Wonderful.
terrific. I really appreciate your presence and your work, and I've got a real good vibe about this. So thanks, Gregg.
Great, man. I've appreciated listening to you both on various podcasts. It's great to quasi meet you in person, at least the two-dimensional person that is our Zoomtopia these days. All right.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Fantastic. We'll be in touch.